this starts, but oh yeah, it's starting. It always catches me by surprise when the Google, like I feel like they should actually do a countdown and say like it's starting now, because you hit the button and it's like then everyone
Right.
gets caught by surprise. So imagine you have millions of people tune in right now to watch. What do you want to tell them right now?
Oh wow. Well, that's a bit of a cold open. I don't know. I guess we started this conversation about sort of mentorship and like how to best help set appropriate, like be a good role model, I guess, for students in terms of like the amount of work we do, the type of work we do, how how many hours we put in the office, that kind of thing, and how I really like have been struggling to some extent with this. A lot of what people have been talking about on Twitter, in kind of different spheres about that. So
Yeah, it's funny because I want to like, I always like try not to talk about work, but in terms of like me getting people who are professors on the podcast, so we got Claire and we got Jean and we have you, and like
mhm.
the only theme that comes up is how much we work and what to do about it, and it's like that's not what we want, but it's the
Yeah,
only thing
yeah,
we know to talk. Do you like my shirt, by the way? Here, I have a
nice. Yes, as a Black Cat fan, I am. I definitely approve.
There we go. Yeah, I have another cat shirt also. I just found this. I saw this at the UCSD bookstore and I had to get it. I just bought it
Yeah,
online. So,
that's pretty good.
but yeah, like it's interesting because I mean, you've also posted a bunch of stuff on Twitter just asking people and polling people about like just about academia and junior faculty life in general. And like
Hmm.
it's one of the things I noticed by being online for, just being addicted to being online is that like
Hmm.
there's a set of things that like people say online because that looks good. So this thread that we talked about, right? Like the Twitter populist message is, oh, you shouldn't work a lot and you should have
Yeah,
work-life balance. And like if you, I mean, it's even going to extreme as like, I mean, if you have enough followers online, someone's gonna rant at you about like even if you just say that you're working, they're like, oh, you're setting a bad example for the next generation. You are the part of the problem. Like this is a systemic problem and stuff. You shouldn't even be working. You should just shut off your computer at 5 p.m. and stuff.
right.
And then, but in reality, what people talk behind the scenes is the pragmatic realities of that, right?
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I think like I don't know. I don't necessarily want to characterize that reaction as in an exaggerative way. I think people have legitimate concerns about um, I certainly have concerns about some like being in this situation and suddenly uh, kind of having to lead by example, be like recognizing that that now I have people watching what I do and kind of taking that as an example, and that's sort of new and scary to me. Uh, and I do recognize, like, yeah, we have this ability to make to create lasting impact on the people that we're supervising and mentoring, and I want to make sure that that's good impact.
Yeah, I think
But
that's a great point. That's yeah, and like I think we're fortunate in a way because we're in a field where I mean, like I was just overhearing colleagues from other fields. Like if you're in like a physical sciences and life science, if you're in a lab, right? Like
mhm,
I feel like that kind of lab culture is a lot more intense. Like, you have like all these postdocs in your lab and you're running these experiments and you're in lab doing stuff with animals or with pipettes and stuff. And like you really are putting in those hours, right? Like it's
yeah,
sort of like an expectation that you're there all weekend doing your lab thing and like
mhm,
people are commiserating and stuff and like I mean I kind of personally chose to go into a field where we have more flexibility and time and you don't have to like grind 24/7 in a lab unless the weekend before a deadline or whatever. So part of that is a lifestyle choice of even what field to get into.
yeah, definitely. I do think in some ways there's a trade-off, right? So if you have a lab setting or even in computing, there are some people who need specific equipment to get their work done, and yeah, on the one hand, that takes away some flexibility, but on the other hand, it does mean that when you leave, you can leave your work behind, which is something that I've struggled with since basically since being a computer science undergraduate. Is just
Right.
this concept of I can carry my work wherever I go, so I can always be getting something done in a gap of free time.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this online too of You're also a fair amount younger than me. I'm also like old. I'm older than I look, and it's
Okay.
like I'd actually found that it's easier for me to deal with this issue of you can work anywhere. Is that like I just get really tired at night and I can't
Yeah.
work. Like I'm just
Hmm.
really tired. Like
Hmm.
I just can't. And also just physically, I used to be able to, right? But now I'm like
Yeah.
not even an option anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't I definitely don't pull all-nighters anymore or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, but sometimes just this kind of default in my life of always looking at a screen, whether it's for work or for play, because also a lot of my hobbies are screen hobbies. It does make it so like even like I now struggle with this whole, with getting to bed on time a lot of the times because screens keep you up at night. So
Yeah, it's very much first world problems
yeah,
podcast. But yeah, it's true that
yeah,
it's and also just like the kind of anxiety that goes with being connected all the time, right? Just all this infinite feed of information and stimulation and such. And people
yeah.
do all these things with unwinding and
Hmm.
such. But I like this idea of, I mean, this theme I want to go back to of like that we are implicitly setting an example, right? Like it's
Yeah,
weird too, because like as people who are fairly junior, like I don't feel that I have much authority or whatever, but in fact,
yeah,
implicitly we do, right? We have
yeah.
graduate students, we have classes we teach. So whatever we say and do, it is like people are looking up to that. Because I don't feel like I'm some senior distinguished figure or something in a suit, but
Right.
like it is true.
Yeah, and we have control. We do have some power over them. We have control over the grades of students in our classes. We have, most PhD students are just living on their stipend, and so we have control over their livelihoods to an extent. So I do think that power dynamic matters and sort of contributes to. Makes it so that it's not quite just as much as we would sometimes like to pretend, oh, we're just collaborating as buddies or whatever. It's not quite like that. So.
Yeah, and one thing that this is not the time thing, but this is one thing that I've been very cognizant of is how I communicate, right, with people who are students, both verbally, but also more importantly, like writing and emails. And I remember, my advisor was kind of a man of few words, kind of like he never really talked that much, and he would like didn't really communicate super a lot on email and stuff. And
Yeah.
it's kind of freaky, like kind of the freakiest thing if you're an early stage student, if your advisor sends you like a one-liner email saying like, can we talk tomorrow morning
Right.
9 a.m. right? And you assume the worst, like, oh my god, what did I do? Like, am I in trouble? But so I
Yeah.
always kind of am more reassuring, like even to
Yeah.
the point of being more like saying like, there's something that I want to talk about related to this project. It's not a giant deal, nothing urgent, nothing on fire, but I'd like to see if we can meet tomorrow morning, just to reassure them it's something I don't want to
Yeah.
freak out about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've encountered that too. Just like I've been taken off guard by just the way that students will interpret a comment that I make because I'm like in a hurry and just I'm not thinking about it very much. And then, like we have a meeting and they're like, so what did you really mean by that or something? I'm like, I really did not think about it as much as you were thinking about it. Um,
Yeah, it's a I think my advisor is actually pretty good at that, even if he was a man of few words. Because I remember one thing he did really well was that he would always kind of preface a lot of what he said with, you don't have to take the suggestion, but here's an idea, or like, I'm not saying you have to do this, but here's what I think. Here's three alternatives, versus
yeah.
like, we really need to do this now. It's a priority. So kind of balancing what you say with kind of a priority level or severity level,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Um, yeah, because I feel like, one way to think about it is, you know, putting yourself in the shoes of someone who may be just starting out in research or in a class who, thinking about we have a large variance of students who are, from different backgrounds in our classes, thinking about how those words might appear to someone who might not have a lot of self-efficacy, who might not have a lot of self-confidence in the field. Yeah, it's a it's a hard thing and something that because everyone transitions into gradually, people might not develop these habits because they feel like, oh, I'm a young assistant professor, I'm 28, 30 years old, I'm not that
Yeah.
senior at all.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like even when I talk to people who are more senior, though, there's a sense of sort of every student is different, and so even if you learn some strategies for uh, kind of managing what your first couple students or whatever work well with, that's not necessarily going to translate well, and that brings to mind something that I was thinking about in light of this whole kind of how much do you push? How much do you sort of try to encourage people to self-care, that kind of thing, which is really about like the set of expectations people grew up with. And how, in some families, like you grow up with like these strong expectations of you should always be working as hard as you possibly can. We expect the absolute best from you all the time. And I find that like students who grew up in that kind of situation tend to respond very differently to expectations about work, amount of work and that kind of thing. And I sometimes have trouble relating to it because I grew up in a family where the expectations were much more relaxed, where it was even in some ways like the idea of making work the center of who you are was kind of devalued. And so for me in grad school, it was new to me, this idea that like being pushed and wanting to work was actually sometimes a good thing, was like enjoying your work or getting invested in your work could be a sign of positive progress and positive mental health and that kind of thing rather than negative. So like that seems to really vary from student to student.
Yeah, and it's a tricky issue too, because as you know, imagine like in grad school, if your peers are pushing you and you're all encouraging her, that's one thing. But on the other hand, like if someone is an advisor or in a position of power or authority is saying that, then you could imagine people taking that as something like, oh, it's someone else wanting me to do something for their interest, and it's not really my interest. And like, how do you, as someone in our position, how do you convince someone that it is in your interest to work hard and to achieve and such, and it's not just because you're doing something for me, right? It's really your own career you're building up and such.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And just that there is just definitionally from a position of authority something that you can't really give them that their peers can give them. And yeah, this question of how to facilitate a good group culture, both in the sense of both in the classroom, like in the sense of students learning from each other, and in the lab in the sense of students being able to collaborate and kind of give each other good support and so on, is something that I still find deeply mysterious and would love to know more about how to do successfully.
Well, and that's why I think you've been really open about being online and soliciting these sorts of ideas from other folks. So have you found some of that to be useful, or have you found it to be like really contradictory? People say really different things.
Well, I found it to be useful. Both of those things. People do have like really varied approaches to mentoring groups, and something that, and so but it's still useful because what I take away from that is that I need to do some experimentation, right, and kind of see what works for me and my group. And so one of those approaches that I've learned about is like the concept of tiered mentorship, where you sort of involve senior PhD students in the process of mentoring junior ones, or all PhD students in the process of mentoring undergrads, which is something I'm trying this summer. And I found that approach interesting because it sort of, for the students who are doing the mentoring for the first time, it gives them, it tends to be very eye-opening for them. I think that they kind of get to step into these shoes of what's it like to try to manage a project and, mentor someone who's new at this.
And do you think that helps them understand your situation better because they have to be a mentor as well?
Yeah, I think part of it is like selfishly, I like this because I think it helps them see my point of view a little bit more. I also think it can be valuable for any of them who are thinking about being professors. I think it's a valuable experience for them to have, to kind of see how much time it takes is something that they often comment on, and what that experience is like.
Yeah, and also, even if they're going to industry, this sort of project management, understanding how people work, that's like super good skill anyways.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff here. It's I'm in an interesting position because I feel like I'm a I feel like I'm a quote unquote old assistant professor. It's the end of my fourth year. I'm about to start my fifth year, and and I'm in an interesting state because it was very different than my first 2 years. Because right now I'm basically at the state where where I tell my students, I'm like, I basically, for the most part, at least for the PhD students, I'm like, basically, I am pretty flexible in what they do as long as they're like working toward publications in our field, right? It's like if you are working toward a relevant publication in HCI that's sort of relevant, that is along the lines, like it's all good, and
Mhm.
what I say is that like you kind of, the motivation for this is you stand to benefit a lot more from your paper than I do, because I have, however many N papers, and N+1 is good. But for you, if you
Yeah.
have 0 papers, from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2, it's really
Uh-huh.
important for your early career. So like I find that the interests align well there, because I'm like, it's not like I have this ulterior motive, like, oh, I need to crank out a bunch of papers. I have a bunch of papers. It's fine.
Mhm.
You do your thing that is the most promising, and obviously we want to work toward papers because that's just more tangible. But like
Mhm.
it's very different than the first 2 years, where like we got to actually like ramp up the research group and crank out a bunch of early papers and stuff. So, and I think that
Yeah,
hopefully as
interesting.
you get more senior people, that's why more senior people branch out more, right? Because they have tenure and they're promoted and they have 500,000 papers. For them, an extra paper is great, but it's really what what directions the students or these projects are going. And so it's very different mentality than if you're a postdoc or a new assistant professor, where you have a much more direct focus path. Right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that sounds like the right way to do things. That's not necessarily the way I've been doing things, because I have not, really put a whole lot of intentionality into this. A lot of it has just been like, well, I have a lot of research interests. What I talk to my students, I find out what they're interested in, and that's the path we wind up taking.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, that's a
So
really good path. I mean, I think that's like,
yeah, yeah. Although it does have, I do wind up kind of fragmented in a lot of different directions sometimes. But I think right now I'm trying to justify it to myself as putting a lot of like planting a lot of seeds, right, with this garden metaphor that I've really borrowed from Chris Parnan. Planting a lot of seeds and trying to see how many of them grow, and trying to be a little bit uh, ruthless, or like not afraid to cut some of them back if they're not going anywhere.
yeah, I think that's fine. I mean, there's multiple paths to success. I mean, I think that like if you really scale it back, I mean, a lot of it is, if you're working, I mean, the simplest formulation is if you're working toward submitting papers in your field generally,
Hmm.
that's what we do, right? And
Hmm.
some people are really focused and determined. It's like I'm going to have several papers on the exact same topic, really deep. Some people are like, yeah, we'll do certain things, but I think that at our stage, it's like your skill set and your interests are still in this realm, that the field you're in. You're not going to be submitting papers in, high energy physics or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's I'm reflecting on this kind of the directive of just always be submitting papers in your field, and I'm thinking a little bit about I guess it's, well, in my nature to be contradictory about things like this, but at one point, a colleague in my department made a comment about how sometimes it seems like we focus too much on outcomes in the sense of individual metrics, right? Like um, not just number of papers, but quality of papers, and like all these things that contribute to how we look on paper and everything. But we don't really talk about, like, when we're at our, it's kind of like you were saying at the beginning of this, like we talk a lot about how much time we're, about our time management, about our how busy we are, and like share strategies for time management and stuff. But we don't often talk about the stuff that apparently we're in this for, right? Like the science and the advances in the field that we're actually trying to work towards. So something that I don't really have very clear thoughts on this yet, but something that I've been thinking about is how to sort of promote a healthy attitude in my lab about that, like trying to make the science, or the contributions, the knowledge construction, the center of things, and not the concrete outputs of those, except in cases where it's pragmatic.
Yeah, I think that's a great. I mean, that totally makes sense. I don't think that's controversial
Yeah.
at all. I think that
Yeah.
that's actually that's a thing that I think everyone strives toward. And one way to think about this is, you know, is that the papers or whatever, or just the intermediate points or the dissertations, or their checkpoints, right? That
Yeah.
on the the taking the other extreme of, if you want a really idealistic view of things, that then it's actually hard to be really concrete, because in a way, if you think about papers as forcing functions to make stuff into
Yeah.
a concrete form, then that doesn't seem as daunting, right? It doesn't seem like such a grind. It's like, all right, we're doing this thing that we think is interesting, and it happens that we can submit something along the way, then it feels a bit more yeah, it feels a bit better in that way.
Hmm.
And then that light, if papers don't get in, that's fine because it's part of the process. We're working towards something we're interested in, and
Right.
something will shake out. That's something good. Yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, I guess the part where I feel this is controversial, even with my own thoughts and feelings on the subject, is that, in some sense, like paper writing paper writing takes up a lot of time, often sometimes more time than even
Yep.
um, working on the idea, analyzing the data, whatever else you're doing. And it's obviously very like requires a lot of skill, requires a lot of time to develop that skill. So I find myself wanting to place a lot of emphasis on communication and being able to talk about our ideas well and develop skills in writing and so on. But I'm wary of that becoming the center, like overtaking the the meat of it, the interesting directions that people are in this whole process for.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a cart chasing the horse or wagging dog,
Yeah.
or I mean, even a even more extreme form of this is writing grants, right? That's an even
Yeah.
more indirect form of this that saps up potentially even more time, is less direct, and is, less chance of success as well. And yeah, I think
Yeah.
everyone has to balance that. Yeah.
Although I currently have a kind of idealistic take on grants right now because recently they have like working on grant proposals I have found has been the time that I can carve out for myself to actually do solitary research, right? To work um, on like new ideas, right? Like to write some code or to uh, sketch a type system or whatever, and like actually work on that, kind of on my own grad student mode, enough to build up the preliminary work for a grant proposal. And in the midst of advising lots of student projects, I don't find many other opportunities to get into that mode anymore. So I don't know. Right now, I think of grant proposals as actually being a good opportunity to engage with research.
Wow,
But
you're like the poster person for academic positivity. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the view that everyone should strive toward, right? Yeah, it is, again, it's a forcing function and an intermediary toward developing ideas that you'd want to develop, right? And regardless of whether it gets funded or not, we all know that most grants don't get funded, but if it's a win for you to take that time to carve out an idea in detail and that leads to different projects or collaborations, that's a win.
yeah, definitely.
Wow, so there's nothing that gets you down. This is amazing. I'm gonna try harder.
Oh no. That wait a minute. I keeping like I think you're not the first person in recent times to have called me like I don't know, like a beacon of positivity or something. And I find this so strange because I think most of the time I'm kind of like the grumpy one who's complaining about stuff. But anyway.
Well, you have millions of fans watching, so maybe you have to put on your best face.
There you go. Yeah. That must be it.
Yeah, there's and I mean everyone approaches it differently, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, what was the other? I'm trying to look at the Twitter thread. Oh yeah, so getting back, I mean, this is something that's more generalizable than academia, but this idea that there's just this paradox, right? That like in order to develop expertise in something, you have to work a long time and hard at it. And also there can be pleasure and satisfaction and fulfillment in getting good at something and
Yeah.
making something really good. But on the other hand, you want to not have that be an unhealthy obsession or be a bad role model to others who might
Yeah.
not want to be totally into it. So how do you think about balancing that?
Yeah, exactly. And this I think goes back to that idea of sort of the differences between students and how they respond. But yeah, and I did because I often find that, and even I think this was true in grad school, that a lot of the generic advice that people try to give budding academics is, kind of makes this assumption that you're just going to be like where you're starting from is working too much, right? That everyone has this problem of just working way too long hours, and and maybe you're not like getting what you want out of those hours, maybe you're not really achieving your own personal goals or whatever, but you're that there's just this assumption that you're working too much. And for me, there was definitely a point in time in which that was not true. And I think many people don't, like, when you start from this standpoint, like a lot of people don't seem to know how to deal with that, like how to get, it wasn't just because I was super balanced and, had everything figured out. It was that I was legitimately, struggling with mental health issues and anxiety about my work and not knowing if I was doing the right thing. And it led to a lot of procrastination. And I don't think we really talk that much about how to help someone, be like, not just work more for the sake of working more, but actually get engaged in their work and find the pleasure in it that sort of is necessary. I don't know if I would say necessary, but is valuable for sustaining interest long enough to do a PhD.
Yeah, I mean, I relate to that a lot throughout my grad school. And I think that's why I wanted to talk about this. I mean, I totally relate to that. I totally know what you mean.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's interesting because I think a lot of people who end up becoming professors were probably I mean, this is a stereotype, but a lot of people who end up becoming professors were probably the ones who had a lot of early success in grad school and publishing papers and understanding the system so that they kind of eased into that transition. Because I remember even when I was interviewing at various places, like people were like, yeah, you like it's like, yeah, you kind of had an unusual time in grad school because like most of the people who were professors published one paper, two papers, whatever, and then
Right.
interviewed, got a job, great, right? But then the two of us kind of took more circuitous routes,
Yeah.
and yeah, and like yeah, and I totally agree with that. Like in grad school, the problem was not me working too much or having too many obligations. Yeah, because a lot of this academic advice is how do you say no to all these service obligations? Like
Yeah.
no one wanted me to do anything. I was just lost.
Right.
No one knew who I was. No one ask anything of me. I wanted to be more engaged, right? I
Yeah.
wanted
Yeah.
to feel like I was part of something and to
Definitely.
grasp onto something. So
Mhm.
yeah, and that kind of gets back to our theme of it's not like there's an alternative. Like I want to genuinely help students find that because they can find that intrinsic, not only the
Mhm.
motivation, but the self-confidence and the kind of, self-efficacy in developing
Mhm.
and becoming a world expert in something. I think it's really empowering.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I found that in grad school and now too, one of the, like, some of the things that have opened my eyes about that are activities that I was pursuing outside of work. So I mean, I do think like there's I don't know if this is universal, but certainly in me there was a craving for this kind of, like you were saying, like self-efficacy and skilling up and getting better at things. And so I found other things, outside of work that would lead to that. And one of the things I had an anecdote about on Twitter was running. And I talked about, pushing myself in that, but also just you know like learning how to run. I say that like it's hard to know how to move your feet, but you know what I mean, like learning how to kind of train effectively and not burn yourself out and like
Yeah, not get
sign up
injured.
for
Yeah,
races and get better and
yeah.
yeah, and not get injured, that kind of thing. For running was like a very powerful mental shift for me that helped me understand how to take a similar approach to grad school. So I think, and I still benefit like now. And, I find myself kind of craving this idea of like finding skills that I might have like just a little bit of just enough, starting out with just enough talent for or inclination for or whatever, that I can make progress rapidly and just to remind myself of that feeling and get interested in it again.
Well, professional tweeting is what you've been getting into.
No, I don't know. I think that's I think I peaked on that and some point
Don't doubt
earlier. I don't
yourself. There's still way more room to grow. You
know. Okay.
haven't gotten into any, giant Twitter arguments yet that have, landed yourself on some news site.
Yeah, not recently.
Um, but yeah, it's a what you said reminded me a lot of, there was this kind of danger. I mean, yeah, I procrastinate a lot in grad school, and it's funny because I talked to a lot of my cohort, and many of us, the few people who were the all stars in grad school that I knew, they were busy doing work, and then there was the
Mhm.
rest of us chumps who were, myself and my friends at grad school. We were talking all the time because we weren't working, and
Yeah.
one of the things we talked about is how there are these dangerous things you can get into that almost feel like work but isn't really
Mhm.
work, and that's really
Mhm.
dangerous because it makes you feel productive. Maybe you're helping out on some things, you're doing something on the side, but like in fact the exercise thing, the running thing you're talking about, doing something and getting something that's completely unrelated is actually, I think, really healthy because then you build up something. It's a different part of your brain, different part of your life, and also you don't fool yourself into thinking it's work. You're like, this is my non-work time, I'm doing this, and then when it's my work time I can actually focus. I think that's incredibly powerful that you framed
Mhm.
it.
Mhm. Yeah. Right. And in terms of those things that feel like work, I think another danger of them is just that they're energy draining, right? They're um yeah, I think we talk a lot about time management, but we don't necessarily talk as much about energy management, which is I think that's an idea I stole from like the NCFDD Faculty Success Program. I don't know if you know
Oh, really?
that
What is that?
whole
Yeah, you
group.
talked about energy man. We can talk about that, but yeah, but what is
Oh
this program?
yeah, yeah. National Center for Faculty Diversity and Development. I think it's just like a national center, and they do all these online. Um, it's like a newsletter, and it's also an online like boot camp sort of. I don't know. They call it a boot camp. It's not really like what you would typically think of as a boot camp. It's really just like a kind of support system and curriculum for specifically for faculty in trying to figure out how to move the needle on the most important parts of our career. So, but anyway, they found uh, they have a lot of different topics that I like. They're all things that are going to be familiar to an academic, but I think the way they frame things can be super useful. And one of those is, this idea of energy management. Like, not all ways of spending an hour are going to leave you feeling the same way afterwards, or leave you with enough energy to accomplish something else that you want to later in your day.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I mean, that is. I mean, because I'm a bit older now, I run out of energy way before I run out of time. Like I'm
Yeah.
rarely time limited. I'm basically
Yeah, yeah.
limited. Yeah.
Yeah, and I find that too, like particularly as someone who doesn't have kids, a lot of people talk about just trying to find the time to get anything done that they want to do, but I often find myself more with like, well, I've got an hour, and if I had more energy, I would want to do this, I don't know, side project or something, but instead I'm just going to watch Netflix because that's all I can deal with right
Yeah,
now.
and that's fine.
Right.
That's a great
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it helps me recharge, and sometimes I need that. So,
Yeah, it's there's a lot of these things that I think everyone independently discovers. It's like many
yeah.
people in our jobs, like we have different paths, right? Everyone does things differently. How we manage students, how we approach our research directions, how we focus. But like, there's a lot of these common things that people have to figure out. And like, I find like I found that I've talked about this quite a bit with people so far, but it is a, I mean, it is a preview for you next. Like there is some kind of phase change after your, say, fourth year or so. Like it's like you're still an assistant professor, but you're a bit farther along. So it's like the direction has gelled more, and you also have more responsibilities, right? Like because you're a little bit more senior in the community, so you have more of the service responsibilities and stuff coming in, whereas in the early years you didn't have as much of that.
Yeah.
So I feel like something is fairly different now for me after the end of year 4 than like after my first or second year. This is your second year, or what year are you?
Yeah, I just finished my second academic
Yeah.
year. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like there's something different, and it's like I think it's just because things ramp up. Like you have maybe more students, you have more ongoing project. It's cumulative, right? I mean, you have older
Hmm.
projects that are ongoing. You're resubmitting papers or grants, and then you have more service coming in,
Yeah.
and it's something to be aware. And one thing I'm really cognizant of is how do I keep doing as much of what I want to do while still maintaining this level of responsibility that will only increase as you get more senior. And that's something that, because you can imagine senior people being bogged down with a lot of obligations, responsibilities, but like, how do you manage that? You can't just say no to everyone. So it's like, how do you
Yeah.
manage that?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think right. And I'm still, I'm definitely still in a situation where I benefit from like, oh hey, day with no meetings. Like I can actually get some solitary focused work done. And I'm certainly worried that may reach a point, like that there may reach a point in my career where that's a little bit harder to come by, or I don't know.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think it's still
yeah,
possible. You just have to
yeah,
work more at it. I mean,
yeah,
I find that myself and people who are even more senior, like the people who can maintain, what they want to do, it's because they spend a lot of time figuring out how to, playing
hmm,
defense in a way, figuring out how to
yep,
carve out that time.
yep,
So, and in that itself, talking about the energy, that itself is energy draining of thinking about how to manage
yeah,
relationships. Be like, oh, maybe we shouldn't meet this week. Maybe we should do this later. Just thinking about that is energy
uh-huh,
draining just to free up the time.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I find out, and I definitely find all the conversations, just not even the, I don't know, the important substantial conversations, but just the conversation, yeah, like rescheduling things and trying to negotiate about how much time to spend on in meetings or whatever is yeah, it can be very draining.
Yeah, it's a or just like other sorts of logistical things that come our way and stuff. But anyways, I want to end this on a more positive note again without I'll let you end the conversation because you can end it on a more positive note. I mean,
Oh no,
what
all
would
the
you want to
pressure.
tell all of your millions of fans on Twitter and here in your final minutes here on the podcast?
Oh no, I'm really not good with this kind of pressure. Do you have anything more specific as a
Oh
prompt?
yeah, I'll just put you on the spot. Yeah, I guess circling back to the beginning of you know, well, I mean, I can bring up a point here that I haven't really talked about this too much publicly, but we'll see what you think about this. That like, we talked about the whole papers thing and like kind of traditional metrics, and like,
Mhm.
I feel like personally, I I like the traditional, well, whatever, having papers every year and stuff like the more
Mhm.
standard fare metrics. I like that because in a way it's a buffer. Okay, I'll put it this other way. So, uh, I'll give you an example. Okay, a concrete example. So, my mother's a professor in sociology at UCLA for many years, and in their field, to get promoted or tenure, you write some big book, whatever. You write an
Mhm.
academic book.
Mhm.
Right? You don't really write papers. I mean, you kind of do these little papers, but some of a book. So then she recently, this is not recent. She had a colleague at I think USC. I don't know which department. This is a while back. I don't know. When I say it's
Mhm.
recently, it's probably 10 years ago, who
Sure.
did not get tenure. And like, I mean, she had her book, she had her whatever. And it was because, there's many reasons, right? But like, it was kind of like a thing. I mean, my feeling is that in a field where you're being judged by one thing, right? Like a book that you
Yeah.
write, a lot of that people's implicit, if you're a minority, if you are, if you're scholarship isn't really in what the majority feels like is good, and people have personality issues and stuff, like if your CV kind of looks like it's all in on one book, or like your talks you're giving, there's so much subjectivity. But if you have a if you have a field with more checkpoints where you are, we have a few papers every year, and it looks, you don't need to have a lot of papers, but there are some checkpoints there that like it's a little bit of a buffer against, I mean, not everything is obviously meritocratic, but it's a little bit of a buffer against people's personal biases that are like, okay, like your CV looks kind of legit, we'll check you off. Whereas somebody else might have very few papers, but they are like,
Mhm.
giving TED Talks, they are, thought leaders, they are, CEOs of startups and stuff, and they get tenure or get promoted because of their charismatic personality.
Mhm.
Whereas for, just growing up as an immigrant, my mother is an academic as well. Like we very, and I think we kind of circle back to the whole culture working hard thing, is that it for kind of people who are immigrants in one way, kind of these metrics in a way are a buffer against kind of cultural
Yeah, I see what
biases
you
in
mean.
a way,
I see
right?
what you're saying.
I'm not putting it super well, but like,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. It's like you can when someone gives you the criteria, like I guess this is something that is research backed, right? It's like if you establish criteria, you're less likely to introduce implicit bias
yeah,
because you're just holding everyone to the same criteria. Yeah, that's something. Actually, yeah, I mean that's something that I care about a lot, or that I think about a lot in the context of grad admissions, which is just I mean, it's a
yes,
thing that I was involved in as a grad student. CMU was weird like that and let grad students be part of the grad admissions
that's
process,
good. Yeah.
which yeah, I think it was a good thing. And but what was this? But like people were so resistant to the idea of introducing criteria because I think we're all sort of we kind of have this uncomfortable relationship with metrics, right? Because we all like sort of are held to them, but we want to make sure that we don't um, that we don't like just bean count and all that stuff. But so I think academics can be a little bit resistant to the idea of metrics. But on the other hand, yeah, they if you do have like if someone who is not inherently disposed to kind of being favored by the academic process. Due to background and bias and all that other stuff, then it is a way of saying like, hey, look, I did the things that were on the checkbox, on the checklist. Um, this is evidence of merit.
Yeah,
I
I find
agree.
that this is actually a great topic. I mean, I want to just go one more minute on this, if
Yeah,
you don't
yeah,
mind.
sure.
The grad admission is a great concrete way to bring that up. So when I was starting out at Rochester, we were a very small department, and it was not, a top 10 giant CS department, right? And my first several students who were undergrads or master students, they were some of them were first generation college students. They were not like ethnic minorities, but they were
Mhm.
first generation college students, and they came from small towns and such, and they wanted to go to they were really into research, and they wanted to go to grad schools at more prominent places. And I
Yeah,
told them, I said straight up, I'm like, we're at a small department. I am a first year faculty. uh you know we're not going to get the benefit of the doubt when you are applying to grad school. So the way we can level the playing field is that we need to publish papers. And like, if
yeah.
you have a paper in a recognized international conference or journal, whatever, that
Hmm.
that is in a way a leveler, in a way, right? I mean, it's not
Hmm.
perfectly meritocratic. I don't want to overstate that,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
there are many students who don't get the opportunities to publish papers. But I said we are working toward that, because not because I want to publish papers. Yeah, that's good too, but because that is sort of your ticket into these top grad schools. And
Hmm.
they ended up so. And also when I started UCSD as well, right? It's like, I'm a new professor. My letter recommendation probably doesn't carry that much weight because no one really knows who I am. But I'm like, if you
Right.
have papers published, people don't really, that's it's already passing a big bar. Whereas I remember when I and some of my colleagues, we were fortunate enough to go to kind of big name schools for undergrad, and we had advisors who were well known. Like, we didn't really need papers published. If you have zero papers and someone who's an advisor who's like
Yeah.
really well known in the community, they vouch for you, like, oh, this person is awesome, they're awesome and everything. That may get someone into grad school. But if I write a letter like that, no one knows who I am, people don't really weigh. Or if you're
Yeah, yeah.
international, right? If you're from another country, you know it's hard to weigh those letters. But if you have a paper presented somewhere people recognize, there is a somewhat equalizing factor. So I definitely saw that from the grad admissions point of view.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've definitely seen that as well. When I, participated in that process for the first time, it was sort of surprising to me the extent to which the conversations were kind of like, well, I don't recognize these letter writers, or I don't
Yeah.
recognize these conferences. And, like, recognition clearly has a lot of cachet, I guess.
Yeah, and the disclaimer here is it's still not perfect, right? I mean, there's still a
Yeah.
lot of noise in this
Yeah, of course.
process, and and
Hmm.
there are students who go to undergrad only colleges who don't have more prominent research opportunities and stuff, and they're
Yeah.
REU programs and other sort of outreach programs. So I'm very
Yeah.
cognizant of that, and for my students who want to do that, I kind of say straight up, like, you're choosing to work with someone fairly junior early in my career. The way we can compete in this space is to be publishing papers that that get us kind of
Hmm.
because we're not going to get as much of the benefit of the doubt if you're applying and I'm writing your letter, or other people writing letters that maybe not in the field. It's just, you might get lost in the noise, right? And it's
Yeah.
something that someone working with someone more senior or more famous can get the benefit of the doubt. And oftentimes, like, as we've both seen in grad admissions, like, there is a lot of variability, right? Someone who looks really good on paper may end up being great or not so great, and someone who may not end up looking good on paper may end up being really good. And it's really hard.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, right. I mean, as with any kind of like hiring, I mean, I feel like I definitely hear this from software engineer hiring too. It's like no one really knows what they're doing, and there's plenty of mistakes in any process that anyone has tried, I think.
Yeah, and the metrics thing is really interesting, because, like, yeah, I totally agree with you that you don't want to, it's a way for, you know, the administration or such to bean count, which you don't want,
Hmm.
right? Saying, oh, we want to be better in this ranking, so we need to aggregate these metrics or force people to conform. Like, you must publish in this one journal because or only journals count for our metrics, so we need to have you publish
Right,
in
right,
that, right?
right.
Like, we need some kind of humaneness and flexibility. But and there's this whole like tyranny of structurelessness thing, right? Of like, if
Uh-huh.
if you this in these organizations, if you say, oh, we have no hierarchy, we're all happy and we just get along with each other, and if you do that, then what happens is that the biases get even worse, because the
Yeah.
people who are the cult leaders just come into power and consolidate power, and without structure to foster that, you're gonna perhaps end up with more dysfunctional social structures. So it's a hard
Yeah.
balance.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think yeah, that's definitely very true. And in those environments, I think or even I don't know, in any academic environment, where particularly for people who are not who didn't, you know, don't have a lot of knowledge, kind of insider knowledge about how it all works, and don't have a lot of mentorship on how to do that before they come in. Sometimes just having that roadmap, like being able to see
Yeah,
here's what people are evaluating you on, is going to be more valuable than just being like, don't worry about it. Everyone, just do good work and the rest will follow,
exactly.
right? I think like just for a lot of people, like for some people, that's going to work because they already have a default kind of structure in place, but yeah, I think there's a uh, I don't like it's there's sort of trade-offs involved in having so much freedom for how we structure what counts as good, like because there are a lot of roads, there's a lot of roads to tenure is something that I see people write about a lot, but because there are a lot of roads, I think that leaves a lot of us with choice paralysis. Like we don't exactly know which road is the best one for us, and so having there be some kind of default there can help.
Yeah, and I think that I kind of like that philosophy of that, having some structure, but the flexibility as well. That, there are many past success, right? There are people, I mean, I'm just talking about the academic route. Like there are people who don't publish a lot of papers, but the few they do are very influential and they are very good at publicizing it, and they are, very charismatic individuals, so that,
Yeah.
that carries a lot of weight. And then there's others who may be more quiet and more kind of, they're not as highly visible, but then they
Hmm.
have a few more publications. So it kind of like balances and stuff. So there are multiple paths, right? So it's not like a
Hmm.
cutoff that you need to have N papers, right? That's way too rigid.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, this is great. So this was the any last thoughts on this before we go offline?
Yeah, I guess I want I, I think what I want people to know, or maybe to take away from this, is that there's no one template for having a happy and successful academic career. That there, again, like, yeah, there are many paths, which is a thing I was just kind of saying I don't want to push too strongly, but I think that more importantly, like, there are paths for people with many different backgrounds. There are paths for people with many different inclinations towards what kind of work you consider valuable, and for people in many different kind of mental health situations, I think is also something that's important to recognize, and many different types of family backgrounds. And I hope that we can work towards making academia a better environment for all people in all of those situations.
Well, that's a great point to end on. Wow, you are like the beacon of positivity and optimism. This is
Apparently.
like a Star Trek future. This is amazing.
Sweet.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll just go offline and chat more. Thank you so much for doing
All
this.
right. Yeah, thank you.